to share with you today is part of a larger effort to think about mid-20th century agricultural, environmental, and rural change on the Canadian prairies through the lens of the Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Administration, the PFRA. The PFRA was created as a federal government agency to assist in agricultural adjustment on the Canadian prairies in the context of the environmental and economic crisis of the 1930s. And as many of you will know, that was a period of extended drought and economic depression on the Canadian prairies. Here are some images, sort of iconic images from that time. This paper is an abbreviated version of an early chapter in a monograph I'm preparing on the PFRA. So how does my paper connect with the session theme of productive conflict? Well, the key point of conflict in my talk today is between what newcomers expected of the Western Canadian landscape. I'm presenting a historical talk today, so we're talking about the earliest settlers to this region, and the environmental conditions of the Prairie region. In the late 19th century, as the Canadian government, in cooperation with interests such as the railroad, worked internationally to promote the Western region as an ideal landscape for agricultural settlement, they presented it as the last best West, using images such as those that I'm displaying you here. It was a deliberate attempt to create an impression of this region as fertile and agriculturally rich. In many ways, our inherited understanding of the 1930s as an exceptionally dry period follows from this focused campaign to promote a particular view of the region, one that emphasized agricultural fertility and glossed over any risk of adverse conditions such as droughts. As we all know, what advertisers promise and what is actually delivered often bears little resemblance to each other. And an up-to-date understanding of the prairie regional environment over the long term sees the period of Western settlement, roughly from the 1870s to the late 1920s, as exceptionally wet. From this perspective, the 1930s, the period of drought, were not a deviation, but a return to a longer-term normal, one characterized by periods of extreme and extended drought. And here's an illustration of this longer-term normal. If you look up at the one blue square on this image, that's roughly the period of settlement, the period in which newcomers arrived in this region. The gray bars down below, the black line, represent decadal droughts, so droughts extending over a 10-year period. The longer chart, the larger golden squares, indicate multi-decadal droughts, so dry periods stretching over multiple decades. What you can see through looking at this, of course, is that drought is far more common than wet periods. That is the normal for this region, or it has been over the longer term. Prairie farmers arriving in this region had no way to understand that, of course. And so they struggled with the difference between what they had been led to expect of the prairies and what their experiences in the wet settlement period had seemed to confirm, and the regional environmental reality that was becoming more apparent in the 1930s. The Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Administration, the PFRA, was in large measure an organization dedicated to addressing this conflict, to reconciling people and landscape through the application of a new agricultural science. Was this conflict productive? Well, I'm arguing here that this conflict helped produce a landscape seemingly in need of agricultural science and a people more receptive to the advice of agricultural scientists. What emerged ultimately was a collaboration out of desperation between people and the PFRA. So in this presentation, I'm going to start by talking about two programs through which the PFRA generated scientific information and disseminated scientific techniques, and those are the two programs named up here. I'm then going to shift to address the consequences of scientific approaches. PFRA's science certainly didn't arrive on the scene and magically reconcile people and environment. Far from it. In fact, new agricultural techniques actually worsened existing weed and insect problems in a number of instances. But these exacerbated problems were in turn addressed through the development of new scientific solutions. And it was ultimately this that further confirmed the role of science in regional agriculture. So district experimental substations and agricultural improvement associations were two major PFRA programs. These programs promoted the adoption of agricultural techniques favored by scientific experts. They also involved the production of knowledge about the prairie environment, and this was collected by PFRA agents and incorporated into the body of scientific knowledge about the Prairie West. In these ways, These two programs extended the penetration of science into the regional landscape. Now, it's important to note that science on the prairies certainly didn't begin with the PFRA. Indeed, science had played an important role in paving the way for Western settlement in this part of the world. And you can point to examples such as early studies by scientific explorers such as John Palliser, Henry Yule Hind, and John McCowan. You can also look to provincial governments who had promoted progressive agriculture through extension programs from the creation of the provinces. And you could also look to the Dominion Experimental Farms, a federal government initiative that provided guidance to prairie farmers. And in fact, the PFRA's early rehabilitation work was ultimately a continuation of the work of the experimental farms. The PFRA was conceptualized in that way as a way to take this work much further. But these various early manifestations of science on the prairies, while fundamental to regional settlement, ultimately shared certain limitations. The assessments of the prairies that they generated and relied on were based on relatively short-term evidence and often failed to adequately account for environmental differences across the prairie landscape. The effects of these shortcomings were particularly evident in relation to summer fallow, the practice of cultivating through a growing season without producing a crop. Beginning in the late 19th century, the Dominion Experimental Farms promoted this approach as an effective means of maximizing yields under dry conditions. But as most people will know, most people on the prairies will know, summer fallow was entirely inappropriate for some regions of the prairies and ultimately contributed to environmental problems in this part of the world. One of the ways that PFRA sought to deal with problems related to summer fallow usage was through district experimental substations. These were private farms operated under expert guidance, and here in this image you see some experts arriving at an experimental substation representing their participation in that way. So these private farms operated under expert guidance would serve as an example of what could be achieved through applying scientific principles in any particular environmental region of the prairies. In 1935, the first year of the PFRA, 30 substations were in operation at strategic points across the prairies. The number was increased to 52 by 1938. And substations were distributed so as to provide representation in the various environmental regions of the prairies. They became a lens through which the local effects of the drought could be perceived and understood by local people. Now, soil drift was the preeminent problem tackled by substations in their earliest years. The problem had to be addressed through multiple strategies, not only because of its severity, but also because of variations in the prairie environment. Strip farming was one available strategy, and here you see an example of strip farming writ large. Strip farming involved laying out fields in long, narrow strips in a direction as close as possible to right angles from the prevailing winds. Alternating fallow and cropped land ensured that drifting soil was arrested by the cropped strips. The key to experimental substations was that recommendations varied by environmental region. Strip farming, for instance, was recognized as ineffective for some areas, particularly those with heavy soil. The notable shift here was not so much from summer fallow to strip farming or to some other technique such as the plowless fallow, but from a broad recommendation to a more nuanced approach, one that evaluated the relation between agricultural technique and specific local environment. If Dominion experimental substations were a means of demonstrating and developing agricultural techniques suitable to local conditions, agricultural improvement associations were intended to promote the adoption of these techniques across the areas in which they were appropriate. Improvement associations were community groups that united member farmers in an effort to improve knowledge of agricultural techniques, determine which methods were most suited to local environmental circumstances, and enact changes across a substantial geographic area. There was an attempt to create organizations that anticipated agricultural improvement associations in 1934, before the passage of the PFRA legislation. These early organizations were termed strip farming associations, reflecting their orientation toward the problem of blowing soils. Strip farming associations were necessary because effective control of soil drift depended on a region-wide action, since soil could be disrupted by blowing dirt from a neighboring farm. As the idea of working together in this manner gained popularity among farmers across the prairies, the term agricultural improvement associations became more appropriate to the range of farm issues under consideration. In 1935, the year the PFRA legislation was passed, 13 improvement associations were formed. By 1940, there were 210 associations on the prairies, with roughly 1/5 of all farmers in the PFRA area participating. The PFRA extended support, both financial and otherwise, to associations in hope that they would promote the adoption of agricultural techniques validated by science for the regions in which they operated. Now, this image here shows one way that agricultural improvement associations promoted progressive agriculture by participating in field days that were held at Dominion experimental substations. So district experimental substations and agricultural improvement associations were key mechanisms through which the influence of science was brought to bear on the Canadian prairies in response to the regional emergency of the 1930s. These agencies offered new approaches to prairie agricultural problems. District experimental substations promoted both education and research, transforming a portion of the prairies into a classroom and a laboratory. Agricultural improvement associations worked across property lines, matching agricultural techniques to suitable environmental areas. So science provided new ways of understanding the prairie environment, as well as new techniques through which to farm it more effectively. But the particular agricultural techniques promoted by the PFRA in the late 1930s and early 1940s also exacerbated certain problems that had long bedeviled the prairie region. A move away from black summer fallow and toward plowless fallow or strip farming helped with soil drift, but hurt farmers in other ways, creating an agricultural landscape conducive to more weed growth and higher populations of certain insects. The legitimacy of PFRA science ultimately depended on its ability to provide workable solutions to the problems that it had itself helped exacerbate. The abundance of crop edges inherent to strip farming created conditions that favored the wheat stem sawfly. And here, obviously, that's an illustration of the insect. And down below, you see the consequences of a wheat stem sawfly infestation. The wheat stem sawfly ultimately weakened wheat stems and causing a mature crop to collapse in a field, as you see here. By 1941, those experimental substations that had initially been focused on the control of soil drift were turning their attention to the control of the wheat stem sawfly. Over the following few years, the situation continued to deteriorate. In the brown soil area of Saskatchewan, losses to sawflies amounted to $18 million per year in 1943 and 1944. Farmers concerned about losses to wheat stem sawflies noticed something in their environment, something that gave them a clue about a technique that they could use to address the problem. What they noted was that solid-stemmed flax was not vulnerable to sawflies the way hollow-stemmed wheat was. So they induced that a solid-stem wheat cultivar would also be immune. Research efforts eventually resulted in the development of the aptly named rescue wheat. This solid-stem cultivar, which was licensed in 1946, allowed farmers to continue to practice soil conservation techniques without concern that they were creating conditions that would ultimately favor the wheat stem sawfly. And it also succeeded in demonstrating the power of the scientific approach to address regional problems. Weeds were a problem from the earliest days of farming on the agricultural prairies. The problem worsened in the 1930s as farmers limited tilling out of a concern to guard against soil drift. Indeed, the plowless fallow could provide an ideal location for the propagation of weeds that were free to germinate, become established, and spread over surrounding lands. Newer approaches to the weed problem emerged through scientific advances connected to World War II. A key factor was 2,4-D, a chemical developed in Britain in the early 1940s in hope of improving agricultural production under war conditions. 2,4-D was notable for how it spared grasses even as it killed broadleaf plants. By 1947, with 2,4-D still very recently arrived on the agricultural scene, its potential was already well recognized by officials. By 1941, 1 in 3 seeded acres on the Canadian prairies was treated with 2,4-D, which is really an astonishing rate of increase over a short period of time. So this image is just an illustration of a tent that was used to test 2,4-D's effectiveness on the prairies. So agricultural techniques promoted by the PFRA turned out to favor weeds and insects. Through both plant breeding and chemical application, the role of science was entrenched and its legitimacy confirmed by how it proved able to offer solutions to the problems that it itself had helped to create. What might have been seen as failures of science, in fact, turned out to be opportunities for the definitive demonstration of the power of the scientific approach. So just briefly in conclusion, conflict between newcomer expectations and regional environmental realities produced a degraded agricultural landscape and a population eager to embrace the more robust agricultural science that was taking shape on the prairies through the PFRA. The new prairie agricultural science differed in an important manner from the science that had gone before. Drawing on greater available resources, scientists in the 1930s developed and employed a finer-grained understanding of the prairie environment, appreciating the agriculturally significant differences in the landscape. The histories of both district experimental substations and agricultural improvement associations reflect broad understanding, both scientific and public, of the importance of matching agricultural practices to local environmental conditions. Ultimately, the PFRA expanded and amplified the scientific approach to prairie agriculture. This new science benefited from the support not only of scientific advocates, but also of administrators and farmers who were desperate to find in science a means of coping with the difficulties of the dirty 30s. But even as the PFRA worked to compensate for the missteps of the past, so were new problems inadvertently created. As summerfowl was part of the Dust Bowl problem, so the agricultural techniques favored in the 30s became part of the region's weed and insect problems. Ultimately, the position of science on the prairies was consolidated as scientific solutions became available for problems science had exacerbated. Particularly in its involvement with agricultural chemicals, it is apparent that the agricultural science that came of age in the 1930s helped establish a trajectory that would be maintained in the following decades. And in the use of 2,4-D, a chemical now recognized for its risks to health and environment, it is also apparent that this scientific solution once again contained within it the seeds of future problems. So what is ultimately produced through scientific attempts to reconcile conflict between people and landscape, further environmental complexity, and enduring agricultural challenges, along with a region and a people invested in agricultural science. Thank you.